Hello, welcome. Welcome to the Zoom on the Roaring 20s. All right, and so we're going to get into a write-up assignment that I've assigned you guys. And so I'm glad to have you. Let me get your names down real quickly, and we'll proceed. Let's see here. All right. So hopefully we'll have a few more. There we go. A few more shortly join us. So welcome, you guys. I'm going to share the page. All right. So let's see here. With the Roaring 20s, okay, it's a bit unique in that just after the 20s, some of the initial accounts of them are portrayed in a negative light. And that doesn't happen very often in US historiography. Usually in the writing of US history, the official, I was going to say the bards, the initial writers of the administrations, etc., right, depict their time period in a romanticized, positive light, which we call court history, right, and defending the administration and praising the exceptionalism or the idealism of the time, etc. But in the 20s, it's unique in that immediately followed by the horrific Great Depression, you kind of immediately went into the narrative of causation, in that the 20s, led to the Great Depression, right? And so there is a bit of finger pointing toward certain demographics, certain decisions, certain aspects of the culture, and of just kind of the zeitgeist, the spirit of that time period, and blaming them for the depression that subsequently thrashed the country. So at any rate, what you have here is oftentimes, though, in that narrative, what almost cannot be left out is the culture war. And the culture war, right, of the 20s, to me, I think of things in simplistic terms, and that is just those who were embracing the changes of the decade versus those who were fearful and anxious about such changes and wanted to stem the tide. Some were even regressive and wanted to go back to an alleged olden days, right? And so you have those who are embracing the changes oftentimes called themselves moderns, and those who were afraid of such changes called themselves traditionalists. All right. And so what were some of the areas of combat, if you will, where this culture war took place? It was, for one, right, it was with the new consumer oriented culture. America in the 1920s, you see a lot of people buy on credit for the first time and consume products that they didn't necessarily need. Luxury goods, right? Like most famously radios and automobiles, etc. And so you have this alleged, this accusation that Americans became hedonistic in the 20s. They were living for short range, instant gratification and pleasure, and they were caught up in this gaudy spree, as F. Scott Fitzgerald called the 1920s economy, and they got sucked into it. And so you have people contending that Americans were becoming too consumer oriented, too selfish, and like I said, too hedonistic, living simply for pleasure and living for the moment. Another part of that consumer oriented culture is it was very youth oriented. When you look at advertisement coming of age, when you look at the rise of Hollywood, and the radio and different forms of entertainment, there was a veneration that we're accustomed to today still, but was somewhat, I don't know if I would say novel, but perhaps so. that was a bit novel in its scope and how big it became in the 20s, and this praise for all things youthful. And young Americans going to college tripled in the 1920s, particularly young women being able to go to college for the first time, having the tied to that collegiate education, right, which you're probably accustomed to today, was kind of a modern notion of adolescence, whereby you could kind of sow your wild oats in college, and you have time, right? You have this incremental gap between childhood and adulthood before you have to really hunker down and work 9 to 5 and raise children and all of that. And so at any rate, people were blaming the automobile, college, Hollywood, the radio, electrification and urbanization. A lot of Americans moved into cities and they became electrically powered. And so thus came nightlife. And then, of course, associated with all this was jazz music. Jazz music took the country by storm. And jazz music, it developed an identity that was tied in its reputation to African Americans in particular, as an African American genre of music. And with that, it kind of hit a chord of fear in American, cultural traditions, going back to the days of slavery, a fear of miscegenation, of Black and white people getting together and having sexual relations, etc. And so jazz music and jazz, dance halls, etc. You'd see at times you would see in the big cities, Black and white young Americans dancing together to this quote Negro music. And so, Adolf Hitler over in Germany, he banned jazz music. Such was the association with this fear of miscegenation between Black and white young men and women. So you have fears of that sort. You also had the Prohibition Crusade, whereby we pass an amendment to prohibit the manufacturing, the sale, the transportation of intoxicants. And by way of the Volstead Act, that was anything that was 0.5% alcohol. So cough syrup was no longer legal. And so, as you're probably familiar with, we're going to have a subsequent amendment that abrogates it. And so it failed, basically, this prohibition amendment. And so, but the traditionalists tended to be for the prohibition of alcohol, and the moderns tended to embrace the freedom of drinking, should you want to. You also had issues with immigration. Congress became very conservative in the 20s and passed some quota acts that were very very discriminatory. One of them, it stated that the percentage of people from your nation of origin that was put down in the 1890 census, right? That percent, whatever number that was in the 1890 census, you could only have like 5% of that number each year come in from that country. And why were they doing that? Well, in the 1890s, as you recall, in the second Gilded Age assignment, a lot of, quote, new immigrants were coming in from southern Italy and from the Balkans and from the Russian Empire, from the Near East, etc. And so they were particularly discriminating against them, trying to limit the number of people that could come from their nations. So that's another area where it was fought. And then you also have the, tied to jazz music and so forth, the Harlem Renaissance. And that was a rebirth of of cultural flowering of African American culture, right? Especially after the Great Migration. After the Great Migration of African Americans during World War I and leading up into the 20s, you had, what was it? Let me look up my numbers here. According to my notes, you had 9.7% of the northern population in the census reports prior to the 20s was African American, less than 10%. That went up to 34% in the north. And they tended to congregate in the major cities. From the cities, they averaged about 10% of the population of big cities like Boston, Philadelphia, Detroit, Chicago, New York City, up to 73%. And of course, they tended to move into enclaves. And an enclave is like an ethnically homogenous area where it's all Black people living together in that side, that portion of the city, et cetera, right? So they come up and they have a, starting in New York with these different literary contests, and through Broadway, you're gonna have this Harlem Renaissance. And Americans really, as far as the consumer part to it, really imbibed it. They really drank it in. But did it do away with discrimination? Did it help the African Americans integrate into white society and into white institutions? And so at any rate, that's another area where the culture war was fought. And then you also have the teaching of evolution, of macro species evolution, from Darwinian, Darwinian works. That was a big battle, and it was fought all over throughout the South and the Midwest in particular, but it got a big stage in Tennessee over the John Scopes trial. So you have a lot going on in the 20s regarding this culture war. So with a new woman, as she was called at this time period, right? You have an interesting kind of investigation, a sociological investigation known as the Muncie, Indiana report. And in it, the results of that investigation caused alarm throughout the country. They found that like half the young ladies that were asked if they had had premarital sex, these girls in college, half of them conceded and said yes. And you got to remember that this chronologically is following the Victorian era. In the Victorian era, it doesn't mean that everybody lived up to it, right? But you kept it hidden if you had premarital sex or extramarital affairs. It was seen as scandalous. Coming from Queen Victoria, the Victorian era was very, very strict regarding Judeo-Christian notions of sexuality. Just sex only within marriage between a husband and a wife, very traditional, very old school. And so this is followed up by reports like this in the 20s of young women having sex before marriage. And of course, why are we harping on women? Because from the Victorian era, there was a blatant double standard. Of course, that men are pigs and that there's no changing that they have insatiable needs. And so there was a tacit acceptance of prostitution, etc., in the urban, culture. Or I'm not urban, in the Victorian culture. But women, of course, were supposed to be chaste. They were supposed to act as if they didn't even enjoy sex in marriage. If you look at studies of Victorian culture. And so at any rate now, right, the country is just greatly alarmed. And so again, they blame college and adolescent stage that's burgeoning at this time. They blame jazz music and nightlife and urbanization. They blame the automobile for giving them an escape and freedom from chaperones, which was standard in Victorian culture, as well as within many immigrant cultures, to have chaperones with young ladies dating young men. And so, yeah. And then they became very kind of visibly salient, like you could see them everywhere through different mediums, like advertisements, Hollywood, and of course Coco de Chanel's attire, right? The flapper outfit that you can't quite see. We're covering it up on the top right here. And I'll be happy to put this PowerPoint up online. I don't think I have yet done that. So at any rate, divorce rates rose from 1 out of 10 marriages to 1 out of 6. But allegedly in the 20s, 2 out of 3 divorces were initiated by the wife. And again, with the double standards, men have been free to divorce their wives, but it was seen as scandalous for the wife to dare have the autonomy to declare independence from her husband and divorce him. And not only that, you have throughout the states, women winning the rights to have no-fault divorces, because from the old traditional culture, right, and political tradition, going all the way back to the Bible, you only had the legal means of divorcing your husband if he were physically abusive for a long period of time, if he abandoned you and the kids, and as your quote breadwinner, failed to continue to provide for you, and of course if he were unfaithful to you. And so now with the no-fault divorce laws, people were progressives and traditionalists were concerned by that. All right, so people looked at it, and also F. Scott Fitzgerald, right, The Great Gatsby, and these other works that he wrote. He oftentimes depicted women as the femme fatale, right, as the fatal praying mantis who devoured her man, who cheated on him or left him or played games with his heart or had sexual relations with him and then were just kind of frivolous about it and moved on with her life and left him brokenhearted. And so you see that in his works. And it seems to have been a bit of an autobiographical tinge to it when you look at his real life marriage to his wife, Zelda Sire. So yeah, Lois Long wrote an article in the New York Times about nightlife for women. And she was just very brazen, very open about it, about finding opportunities to meet, the expression then was strange men. And of course, by strange, just strangers, people that prior to that evening, they didn't know. And yeah, so you have Lois Long's article, and people thought that was scandalous, that the way that she wrote so openly about sexuality and the way that she lived her lifestyle. She tried, you know, the experiment of partying on a normal basis and was known for coming in the middle of the night, hungover, and writing her articles from experience. And then, of course, with Hollywood, I read an interesting book that that depicted 3 actresses as a microcosm of the waning standards in sexuality for women. One, right, was like they started with, oh, shame on me, I should remember these names. But the first one, give me just a moment here. Come on. You have, give me just a moment. Sorry. Mary Pickford. And Mary Pickford is the damsel in distress. You see her with the long hair and the pigtails, kind of the Victorian woman. She is independent. She's minded and stubborn and a bit defiant, but she's helpless. She's a damsel in distress. And then you have Clara Bow, a little further into the 20s. And Clara Bow would have relations with more than one man in her movies, oftentimes. but there would be a conservative theme to it, and she would suffer for it. And then, according to this book, Louise Brooks, it fell to her by the end of the 20s, and she was an unapologetic kind of frivolous femme fatale, who kind of boasted about how many men she had been with, et cetera, et cetera. So in the book, they were saying that was telling of the culture of the 20s, these three leading women on the screen during that decade. And then, of course, right, you have, Bill Haywood and the Catholic Church, and they formed a committee, and they wanted to censor. They had a big movement, a conservative movement, to censor Hollywood as to what could be put on the screen and what could not be depicted. And so that's the origin of rating movies, rated PG, rated R, et cetera, there in the 20s. And then you had scandals amongst the Hollywood stars. Douglas Fairbanks took, I just named her again. She's of the three, the one I can't ever remember. The first leading lady took her supposedly from her husband, and they married, and that was seen as scandalous to a lot of Americans. Fatty Arbuckle was tied to a case of rape and murder of Virginia Rapp, and he got off legally, but a lot of people believe that he was absolutely guilty. And the story goes on, and Errol Flynn and all these other leading actors and actresses were just depicted as having a very wild lifestyle. Then you also have, let's see here, with Prohibition, by way of the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act, limited success. So Congress only gave $2 million initially to enforce it, and at its peak, it only had 3,000 federal agents for the whole country, and then it counted on the states to uphold the amendment with their own bureaucracies and their own police forces. And so not enough resources, according to a lot of people. There are 12,000 miles of border and coast to cover, and 10% of the National Guard was fired for being complicit in the illegal trade of alcoholic beverages. And that's just 10% that got caught, right? But there were, just from 20 to 22, there were 65,000 criminal hearings with a 60% conviction rate. Guys named Izzy and Mo Einstein and Izzy Einstein and Mo Smith had 4,000 arrests in 5 years and became famous as kind of these marshals against alcohol. But I have here, for every distillery, illegal distillery that was caught and shut down, 9 still operated. And they think that they only caught about 20% of the illegal shipments across the borders, only 20%. So at any rate, I mean, you had Chicago Mayor William Hale Thompson, the mayor of Chicago, who announced he is not going to enforce prohibition. He was philosophically, politically against it, but then he was followed by William Dever, who tried to turn it into a crusade. And then, of course, you have the underground that proliferated from this, mainly organized crime. And at any given time in a year, they think that bootlegging earned about $2 billion every year. Of that $2 billion, in my notes here, I have, where is it? 70 million a year supposedly was earned by Frankie Yale, what's the other gentleman's name? Johnny Torrio, and of course, most famously, Al Capone of the Italian mafia in southern Chicago or Cicero. And so you had from 20 to 24, you had 200 gang slayings in Chicago alone. You can look up a guy named Dion O'Banion, the Jenna brothers just killing one another, a guy named Jaime Weiss and Bugs Moran against Al Capone, the Hawthorne Hotel massacre, and the St. Valentine's Day massacre. And so, you know, at one point, Al Capone was put on the front of magazines. A gentleman asked him, you know, how are you living such a lavish lifestyle? And he grinned at the journalist and said that his furniture business was doing well. And of course, that was a joke to everybody. Everyone knew what he was doing to yield that profit. And so, yeah, so Americans at that time, that a lot of them saw it in libertarian way as just a matter of personal freedom. And that goes along American libertarian political tradition from the colonial time period. Big brother not telling me what I can or cannot do, especially privately and socially. You have perhaps the zeitgeist in the 20s of just living for the moment and enjoyment, especially in the times of plenty. Because you have to remember also the economic context is according to, I have it on your, let me see here. Let's see, I'm going to move up because I want the stats on the economy. And I know they're in my notes, but right here, this was all possible because Americans could now purchase on credit. And because, as historian Larry Schweikert contends, per capita income had increased from 522 a year to 716 between 21 and 1929 in real terms. So also keeping in mind inflation. And so, yeah, purchasing power, actual purchasing power, extra money in your pocket, increased per capita pretty well during the 1920s, pretty decently. And so that's something to think about as well. All right. Also with prohibition, is some people saw it as an xenophobic legislation. Remember, that's being fearfully hateful toward things other than mainstream WASP culture, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture. And so there was kind of an anti-Catholic bent to this. When you look at some of the legislators in Congress and some of the lobbyists, there was definitely an anti-German bent because the Germans, the German community had kind of pigeonholed they had almost monopolized the beer industry. And so there was a dichotomy that was split, that a lot of Catholic immigrants, Jewish immigrants, older Lutheran Americans, etc., tended to be known as wets for the right of people to drink. And then a lot of mainstream WASP evangelical denominations like the Baptists and the Methodists, etc., tended to be dries. And so some people saw this as a discriminatory act aimed toward German immigrants, toward Catholics, etc. And yeah, so you have all this going on, and that's one of the questions you have to choose from. And then, of course, the Harlem Renaissance. It caught the nation's country by way of a certain crossovers. One was Bessie Smith on the radio. Another one was the Shuffle Along musical that took the nation by storm, according to sources I've read. Carl Van Vechten, his studies and his book, it's called Inward Heaven, was like a equivalent to like a bestseller in the 20s. And it was showing the plight of poor Black adolescent young men in the cities. And so, And then, of course, the NAACP, which had been formed in 1905, right? The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. They instituted certain artistic, intellectual, musical competitions at this time. And that's when people like Langston Hughes, who won a poem contest, became famous. And you have the Cotton Club and these other big clubs that opened up for this Black entertainment and this new Black jazz music, etc., with Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong. And Josephine Baker took the nation by storm as well, as a singer and an entertainer. But look what I have here. It says that the quote, Negroes were the exotic scapegoats. Josephine Baker as a case in point. If you Google her, almost everything, every image that comes up on Google, she is very scarcely clad. Americans, white Americans wanted her as a sex symbol, this exotic sex symbol. But oftentimes where she would go into hotels and restaurants in the cities in which she would entertain, they would not even accept her. And so that's something to think about as far as the point of acceptance for African Americans and integration into institutions. I'm not aware in the 20s of the opening, any changes in Jim Crow laws, any added enfranchisement rights or citizenship rights in the northern states for African Americans at this time. As far as integration in neighborhoods, you could look at Philip Payton, and he tried to bring Black Americans into Harlem, New York, and over 100,000 white Americans left when the African Americans came in, known as white flight. And so you have also the writings of, let's see here, the obvious one is Langston Hughes, but also Claude McKay, right? And Countee Cullen, Cullen. And you find in their writings this kind of identity crisis that African Americans were experiencing, this quote, new Negro. And that is that on the one hand, he wanted to earn the respect of WASP America by living up to the standards of WASP Americans, of, being educated at an Ivy League school, becoming a successful entrepreneur and making good money as a businessman or woman, trying to become as well-read and cultured as possible, and live in an affluent and very kind of cosmopolitan manner and environment. But the thing is what they have found, and what's telling in their writings, is oftentimes they have a symbolic kind of Sambo character in each of their major books. One is called Not Without Laughter by Langston Hughes. Another one is called Home to Harlem by Claude McKay. And you find in these that you have an African American who lives up to that slavery time period, crude stereotype, and that is the African American man is animal-like. He's very instinctive oriented. He wants to chase after women, because there was always this fixation during the times of slavery of Black men getting with white women sexually. And so that he's just a man of appetite. He doesn't think for anything other than living for the day and meeting his physical carnal needs. He's not very thoughtful about his future. He's not very thoughtful about the meaning of life and improving his plight, et cetera, et cetera. But what you find, kind of like in some of the works of the slave figures in the writings of Mark Twain, is you find like that court jester stereotype, where at the superficial level, he seems just that, but by the end of the novel, he spits forth some great wisdom. And he kind of reminds the uppity Negro, the one who has pretensions, who has hopes, who expects to be integrated into white society, who sees himself as being other and better than his other Black contemporaries, right? Kind of puts him in his place and reminds him, you're no different from me. You might put on this sophisticated facade, but white America is never going to get past your skin color. And you're never going to be seen as anything other than a Black man by white America. And so then you have this sense of almost shame that the protagonist has, the Black protagonist, and saying, you know what, maybe I don't want to go to an Ivy League school. Or maybe I do, but I also am going to remember my roots and be proud of being African and being of African origin and Black. So then you had this renewed interest in things African. Zora Neale Hurston got into anthropology as a Black woman writer, and as like an anthropologist, into the culture creating power of slaves as she did her studies. Countee Cullen was really into African customs, cultures, in particular music, religion, and art that you're going to see in his writings and in his lifestyle, and what he studied and what he bought and kept at his home, etc. And so it's very interesting stuff. All that this decade is just packed with information and so forth. So you have there, excuse me, Claude McKay, look up his poem, If We Must Die. Very interesting, whereby he states basically, if we're going to be cornered like a rooster in a hen house, we as Black men, then we might as well go down swinging. And so you have this kind of defiant component to some of the writings in the Harlem Renaissance. Singer Paul Robeson, he accepted communism and joined the American Communist Party and traveled to the Soviet Union and sang there. And the American government tried to keep him from coming back. Excuse me. Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican, did a big tour through America, and he taught pride in being African, the whole kind of predecessor to the Black is Beautiful movement of the civil rights movement. And but he encouraged people very cynically that you're never going to be integrated, you're never going to receive, social justice here in the US. So let's move back to Africa. And so the government went after him as well and got him on tax abnormalities and got him arrested. And so there was like a big kind of oppressive, regressive reaction of the government to him. All right. And then let's see here. And then you have the monkey trial, the Scopes trial. And that was taught in Tennessee. It was Hunter's civic biology textbook, which was banned by the local school board in a biology sophomore high school class in Tennessee. And so he was fired. And the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, fought for him, as did religious modernist leaders. Some religious modernists, what they were trying to do is they were trying to reconcile or integrate some of the findings. You had findings in Heidelberg, Neanderthal, like the Neanderthal man, and Piltdown, like the Piltdown man, that some people at that time were wondering if they were the missing link in macro species evolution, of the evolution of one species into another, into human. And so modernists were like Shaler Matthews, and Charles Francis Potter. If you wanted to look that at any rate, they defended John Scopes. And then there were the fundamentalists, who were the uber conservatives at this time period. And that started from a Presbyterian movement at Princeton, whereby they declared a belief in 5 fundamental truths that they would not waver on, regardless of what the scientific community discovered or wrote or tried to teach the young high school and college students. That is the absolute accuracy and divine inspiration of Scripture, or of the Bible, the virgin birth of Christ, salvation solely through Christ's sacrifice, the bodily resurrection of Christ and of his followers, and the authenticity of biblical miracles. And so they weren't going to waver on those 5 fundamentals. And so they became known as the fundamentalists. And so the Christian fundamentalists, right, in the book of Genesis, it states that God created animals and created man separately, right? And so they were afraid that it was going to have a domino effect in people questioning the authenticity of the account in the book of Genesis of the Bible, that they might begin to discard the Bible and everything else, that was stated therein. And then, not to mention, there was a hint of eugenics in that textbook, and eugenics is trying to improve and fine tune human gene pool. And that can be, regardless of where you are on this issue, that can be a little scary, simply because of Nazi Germany and their studies and their experimentations and the way they took it to such an awful extreme, their studies of eugenics. But at any rate, so that scared the heck out of conservatives. And then just telling kids, right, that they had evolved from some type of primate might make them think that they are, it's about a reverend named Amzie Dixon. It was about accountability, about moral accountability, that it's imperative for people to believe or know that they are separate from the animals, that they have moral accountability to God that animals don't have, so that it'll keep them on their toes, so to speak. It'll bring out the best in man, the whole fear of hell and everything in the Bible, and punishment for your sins. And so to them, right, teaching the kids that they were no different from a different primate, some type of ape, etc., that just went down a different tree line, that would create behavioral anarchy. And so they tried to make it very dramatically strategic, this fight in Dayton, Tennessee. John Scopes is going to lose the case. The local jury and judge were conservative Christians there in Tennessee, and so he lost permanently his teaching position. But the press helped the liberals and the modernists quite well in depicting the conservatives as bigots and as kind of archaic, old school, and like I have here the word epistemology, the nature and origin of knowledge, how you come to know what you know. The ACLU and the liberals didn't want people to simply believe something because the Bible told them so, but to follow the data wherever it leads you. And when you don't, right, the negative term for that is dogmatic, where you just kind of stubbornly say, no, this is what I believe. I don't care what evidence, I don't want to look at it, et cetera, et cetera. And, you have contentions that that the Darwinists can be just as dogmatic as the Christians. And at any rate, it was a zoo, this whole trial and issue. And then in the 1920s, the administrations continually had Andrew Mellon. The Republican administrations continually had Andrew Mellon as their Secretary of the Treasury, and he was very pro-business in his policies. So for one, he taxed very, very scantly. The tax rates went down, not just for the rich, but for all brackets of income. The notion was, right, is that is the trickle down economics, right? Infamous with Reagan, is that if you allow people, and especially the rich, to keep their earnings and not take it from them, for one, it gives them the incentive to continue to develop their companies and try to broaden their scope and buy new machinery, engaging in new technology, opening new plants, etc. Right? That it not only gives them the incentive to continue to develop, because knowing that they're going to keep the fruits of their ideas, etc. Right? But also that they will likely use that money that the government is not taking from them in ways that trickle down to other people. So again, if they buy machinery from someone, whoever's making that machinery is going to make money from them. Whoever they hire to do technical work on the machinery, when the machinery goes down or haywire, make money from it. If they buy new plants, they're buying real estate from some other landowner and giving him money for that. Then they hire more workers at that new plant, and it helps the workers through salaries. It does arguably, with someone with a very weak in the economics field like myself, on paper it seems to make sense, but it didn't happen. It didn't happen here in the 20s, at least. And it may not have, I don't know if it has happened. So at any rate, the next generation under Franklin Roosevelt, they are of a much different philosophy. They're for bigger government and the government's responsibility in ensuring economic prosperity. And so they are going to blame this type of philosophy and this type of policy on the Republican Party for the Depression, and saying that the government didn't do enough to ensure. And so what were some of the things that they contended that happened from this laissez-faire government letting it be economy is, for one, was economic consolidation. Big businesses continued, just like they did in the Gilded Age, as we saw at the age of the robber barons. They continue to gobble up many other smaller businesses. So for instance, from 1919 to 1928, there were 1,200 mergers involving the disappearance of 6,000 independent enterprises. And this is from the work of Adolf Berle, B-E-R-L-E, page 37 in his book. And so there was maldistribution of income. So you look at like the gross national product, the value of all goods that were produced. You look at corporate profits. They went up tremendously, much higher than did per capita income. And so the argument is yes, all, in a rising tide, even the little boats rise up in the water, right? But the portion of the pie that was gobbled up by big business was too disproportionately large. Big business reaped the lion's share and then some of this prosperous decade, and it was too inequitable. Because to the next generation, what they believe is one of the best barometers or measuring sticks for a healthy economy is the purchasing power of the average American. Okay, the purchasing power of the average American. And that is from the works of John Maynard Keynes, Keynes, known as Keynesian or Keynesian, I don't know how you say it, Keynesian economics. And so that's what the next generation is going to accept. And so they're going to see this, they're going to blame this, the 20s. So you have Warren G. Harding. And by the way, Warren G. Harding also is depicted as a microcosm of the Roaring 20s. He came in and he just looked at, kind of as he does in the picture here on the far left, just very youthful and strong and had a commanding presence about him. And he's not even going to live out his 4-year term. And he's going to die of natural causes in the midst of multiple scandals, including affairs on his wife, and the Teapot Dome scandal, whereby one of his guys took the Department of the Navy, its access to oil in Wyoming, handed it over to the Department of the Interior, and the Department of the Interior sold it to a private buddy, and they shared the profits of that oil, these private individuals, instead of keeping it with the Navy. And so people went to jail for that. And there were at least 3 or 4 major scandals. Another one was that they regularly took bribes of prohibition. They had a street right there in Washington, D.C., a particular building where people would come regularly and give bribe money to that address to be able to engage in alcohol-related commerce. And so, and when one of them was going to come forward on it, he had a mysterious wound, bullet wound through the head, and they quietly contended that it was suicide, and a lot of people said it was not suicide. So, like I said, kind of a microcosm of the Roaring 20s of just burning brightly, but just quickly fading out, is Warren G. Harding from 20 to 23. Calvin Coolidge, as you see next to him, was seen as an antidote to him. He was boring. He was depicted as boring Midwestern man who drank milk instead of whiskey, liked to fly fish, scarcely spoke, but he was just the same in his economic policies and keeping Andrew Mellon as the Secretary of the Treasury, of not taxing, not helping farmers when they asked for help with their crops, when they could not sell their crops, their produce, just kind of being laissez-faire. But of course, an exception with the laissez-faire thing were import tariffs. The Republicans wanted to put taxes on foreign-made products that came in to kind of force American consumers to buy American-made products instead of foreign-made products. But the problem is we got into the Depression, that those countries put up tariff walls against our commodities as well. So we tried to sell our farm produce back to Europe. They put tariffs on them and artificially raised the price of our wheat and corn so that they bought Ukrainian wheat, etc., instead of American. And then Herbert Hoover, the third one from the left, he was the one that becomes kind of the scapegoat for the Great Depression, because when he came in, when they experienced the first signs of a problem of low purchasing power amongst Americans, where there was overproduction and underconsumption, literally the factories with the automobiles and other major commodities that the economy rested upon were just flooded with goods that weren't being purchased anymore. He gave some kind of blasé speeches in which he stated that, you know, America in a capitalist system will always have ups and downs, and all we need to do is just wait and weather the storm, and there'll be no need to do anything to rectify the system. Don't mess with the system, let it fix itself. And because of those quotes, he was vilified and a huge difference from 28 when he won rather easily to 32 when he was blown out by Franklin Roosevelt, who vaguely said he was going to implement a New Deal, which is tied to his name to this day. And so, yes, you have that. I'll speak a little bit more on him when we do Franklin Roosevelt winning in the New Deal as the next topic. And that's Andrew Mellon on the far right. So at any rate, going back to this, let me know if you have any questions. Let's take a look at the questions here. So, to whatever extent it was accurate, what factors do you believe may have contributed to women's empowerment, liberation, or defiance of Victorian norms? For instance, economic empowerment, an increase in the number of young ladies going to college, the media, the automobile, Freud, postmodernism. Freud, right at that time, was kind of being butchered in popular culture, where, right, he said that if your id is your instincts, your basic instincts, right? So like you have I'll never forget, I brought my little boy into Carmel, into somewhat of a ritzy restaurant that we could scarcely afford to eat. And he saw someone, he was a little older than a toddler, and he saw some food that looked a little appetizing on someone's plate. And as we walked by to take our seat down the aisle, he reached up and grabbed a portion of the man's food from his plate. And so very mortifying, but he was following his id, right? His base instincts, without rational thought, without his internalized mom and dad, right? His super ego telling him, don't do that. There are rules against it. That's against the rules of propriety. You'll feel shame, etc. And so with Freud, right, from what I understood in college, is that he advocated a balance between your id and your super ego telling you don't do that, and these are the norms of your society, etc. Right? But in the 20s, they kind of butchered it and said that if they just kind of showed one side of it, that if you suppress your id, it'll manifest itself in ugly ways, which he did say technically, but he didn't say just completely give in to your id. And so, so some people blame Freud. Postmodernism contended that all truth is relative, that there is no right or wrong. And so it went against any notions of propriety from the Victorian era, like notions like sin, etc. Right? And then with women's earnings, in my notes, I have that according to someone's studies during the 20s, the average young lady living alone was making about $22 a week, or was it not a week? Was it a month? Let me try to find my work here. But at any rate, the argument is that it was $22 a week. And the cost of living, according to this person, was $25 a week. So women were not quite self-sufficient economically in the 20s, but they were close. So they had a little bit more autonomy, and especially also with all the new inventions for housewives, etc. in particular, right? The modern inventions, it happened in the 50s again, in the 20s and the 50s, but the refrigerator, the freezer, the washing machine, the vacuum, and these other home appliances, they helped very much curtail the number of hours of work that was necessary to do daily old school maternal errands of cooking and cleaning, et cetera, et cetera. So it gave them more time on their hands. So they have more education, they have more money. Fewer of them are marrying. It still was only like 1 out of 10 that was not marrying, but that had gone up. More of them were going to college, etc. Number 2, to what extent did the Harlem Renaissance earn popular or institutional respect, tolerance, or inclusion for African Americans? Now, I'm not an expert on this, so by all means, I would like you to especially it being connected to COVID time. I don't expect you to be able to go into the school's library and get a good book on this. Of course, that'd be great if you could. So if you need to just find a site or two on the computer as your source, as well as class notes, that's great. But by all means, maybe I'm not being fair and accurate in my bent on number 2, because you could probably tell from my tone and the information that I gave and some of my subjective points that I don't think it was that successful. I lament that, but I just don't. I think racist white America stayed hardened in many ways in keeping them from integrating. But by all means, maybe I'm inaccurate on that. Maybe it's more complex than that. Number 3, why do you think prohibition failed? And we talked about different aspects of that, different facets to it. Number 4, to what extent were the traditionalist concerns reasonable or justified? They were worried, right, that the country was going to, as you would imagine, the traditionalists said, "I told you so" during the Great Depression. They're worried that this consumer-oriented, id-led, youthful generation was gonna, bring the country to the edge of a cliff, right, with its hedonism. And then number 5, to what extent did hedonism or irresponsible decision-making or behavior during the Roaring 20s contribute to the Great Depression? And you could find things, like I said, on that. Let's see here. I mentioned Adolf Berle as far as he blames policies of the Republican administrations being too laissez-faire, right, and allowing big business to gobble people up. But you also have people like Murray Rothbard, Murray Rothbard, and he gets into investment and savings and saying that no one was saving. And I have some stats on that too, that, that he says the blame goes a lot further than big business, but to the average American consumers at this time. So for instance, in the late 20s, 80% of radios, 3 out of 5 cars were bought on credit. While the top 24,000 families saved, invested, and spent excess profit on luxury goods. Let's see here, from 25 to 29, money owed on credit doubled across the country, from 1.38 billion to 3 billion. All right. So something to think about. Nearly 80% of families, 21.5 million households, had no savings by 1929. And if you wanted to choose that question, you can quote me on that. All right. So does anyone have any questions? I've gained a couple people. Let me make sure I get your names down, okay? All right. Can I get a thumbs up from anybody? You guys been able to hear me? Good. You're not asleep yet? Good. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. So yeah, don't just look at this in balanced fashion. Take it seriously. Try to find a respectable source to cite and to use. Okay. If anything from my lecture or introduction is relevant to supporting your claim, by all means use that as well. But I also know this is just a 1 week paper, so I'm not looking for a 5-page research paper either. So just look at it in that type of balanced fashion, okay? Regarding my expectations. All right. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and call it a day, call it a week, and let you go. Okay. So you guys have a good week. I hope you're doing well.
Professor,
Yes.
first, just wanted to say thank you, and then secondly,
Oh shoot, you're muted again, Cody. I heard you say thank you, and then right after you said secondly, I couldn't hear anything.
sorry, my doing the wrong button. Kennedy asked, when will this Zoom session be posted to Canvas?
You know what? I could do my best to have it posted tonight.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, sorry it takes me so long sometimes.
No worries. Thank you, Professor.
All right, thank you, Cody. You guys have a great week, okay? Thank you, Kennedy.
You too. Have a good day.
You too.